Welcome to Planet Poet Words in Space. I'm your host, Sharon Israel, and it's my special pleasure to welcome back returning guest, the remarkable poet, teacher, and editor, Geoffrey Nutter, who read from his work and share with us his erudition and passion about the haiku form. Pamela Monche Pierce, Planet Poet's wonderful poet at large, will also join us later in the program. Hi, Geoffrey.
Hi, Sharon.
Hi. I'm going to read your bio for everyone who's listening.
Okay.
Geoffrey Nutter is originally from Sacramento, California, but has lived in New York City for many years. He is the author of Giant Moth Perishes, Wave Books 2021, A Summer Evening, winner of the 2001 Colorado Prize, Waters, Leaves, and Other Poems, winner of the 2004 Verse Press Prize, Christopher Sunset, winner of the 2011 Sheila Motton Book Award, The Rose of January, Wave Books 2013, and Cities at Dawn, Wave Books 2016. He has taught poetry at several schools, including Princeton, Columbia, University of Iowa, NYU in the New School, and currently teaches Greek and Latin classes at Queens College. He runs the Wallson Glass Poetry Seminars in New York City, where he conducts day-long writing sessions for people from all over the world and also does private consultations. Geoffrey, I'm so happy to be with you today, and it's great to have you on the show again. You've been on twice before, and it's been too long. And you have a special love for the haiku. You've mentioned it several times in Wallson Glass. Could you introduce us to the haiku?
Sure. I'm going to start with the caveat, though, that I'm a total amateur, not any kind of expert in Japanese culture. I very much approach haiku as a poet and sort of like take from it what it can teach me about poetry. Haiku it's a form I think that we all sort of probably so many of us were introduced to poetry by doing haiku because it's such a short form. I remember being very young in school and being introduced to it, and we were introduced to a certain set of rules that come with it, a 3-line poem that consists of 17 syllables. But I discovered haiku, I sort of rediscovered it maybe more than 20 years ago, 25 years ago, when I found an old book. It was one of these, you probably have seen the old Hallmark books, kind of these Hallmark gift card gift books, this little book called Haiku, Gems of Infinite Beauty. I think it was something like that. It was very sort of kitschy, with a picture of a Japanese woman in a kimono kind of meditating by a stream on the cover. And it was sort of like kind of a joke, but I started reading these poems and so amazing, so vivid. It was really surprising and shocking to me how moved I was by these poems. There was, oddly, I couldn't find anywhere in the book who the translator was, but I only discovered years later that these were translated by the great British haiku translator, R.H. Blythe. So anyway, this prompted me to learn more about haiku. And sort of, the history of haiku. Do you want me to kind of go into a little history and check?
Sure.
So, the haiku is something started in Japan in 1600s, and it started out as a sort of collaborative poetry game. And this is something you see in a lot of cultures, sort of like people getting together and composing poetry together, like I do in my sort of Saturday workshops, right? With these kind of sets of rules that make things more interesting. So it would be a group of Japanese guys. I say guys because probably it was men. Don't totally quote me on that. I'm sure there were exceptions. And what they would do is compose some verses and then pass them to the next person. This was called haikai, or haikai no renga. And the first person would compose 3 lines of 17 syllables. So what we think of today as the haiku, and pass to the next person, who would compose 2 lines. That person would then pass to the next person, who composed 3 lines. would alternate like that between 3 and 2 lines, and it could be maybe 30 verses or 100. But the first person to compose the verse was usually sort of the most honored or experienced poet of the group. And the first verse, the first 3-line section was called the Haiku, Hokku. And the Haiku could sort of stand on its own, and it became sort of its own form. And even then, back when Basho was doing it in the 1600s, there were anthologies of Haiku. So later, just the Haiku. So this was something that usually could stand on its own, apart from this like game where there were all these various rules involved in this, like in the collaborative process. So yeah, and the history goes on from there, and it's like the history of any art form, involving lots of arguments and lots of disagreements about how to go about doing it, and lots of pushing the form and lots of innovation. It's very interesting to sort of see the history, because you see like a history of lots of fun literary disagreements and conflicts.
It sounds very Talmudic.
Right, yeah.
So it became from the Haiku to the Haiku. It changed, the name changed.
It did. And I guess the person who was responsible for this was a haiku poet named Shiki in the late 1800s. And Shiki was kind of a revolutionary figure in the world of haiku. And he sort of really established that 3-line haiku as its own art form. Look how late this is in the history, right? And he called it the haiku. And so it's sort of from Shiki that we get the usage of the word haiku.
Thank you, Geoffrey. So Basho was the first of the famous 3?
Yeah, and he was the earliest of this group. And Basho is an interesting character to me, because he's sort of like one of these people who sort of like starts out as this kind of common, just this kind of grind, who's working with this art form in not a very exciting way, who suddenly sort of starts willing himself into being the great artist that he became. I mean, I guess that happens, hard work gets you there, but he really goes through this incredible transformation in much the same way that the British painter J.M.W. Turner does, right? Who sort of suddenly kind of really willed himself, and through hard work, of course, into being this amazing, innovative painter, from being kind of an academic painter at first, or Keats, who set about sort of this mission of making himself a great poet. But Basho would do these literary events, these haikai, and he was sort of a conventional writer of witty haiku with kind of literary word games and puns. This was a lot of what these were, sort of like clever men sitting around making word games. But then something happened, and he started writing real poetry and turned haiku into this form that sort of embodied spiritual, this sort of activated spirituality, and became really seriously about looking at the world and encountering the world, and interacting with the objective world in really a deeper way.
Did you read us a haiku by Basho?
I mean, the most famous. I mean, this I didn't even mark this poem, but the most famous poem by Basho is what's known as the Furuekeya, right? The famous frog, old pond poem. It goes in Japanese, Furuekeya kawasu tobikomo mizo no oto, or old pond, frog jumps in, splash, or old pond, frog leaps, kerplop, right? And a hundred other translations. But this is sort of the poem that kind of, sort of shocked everyone at the time, because what is this poem? It's not really about the frog. It's kind of about the sound, but it's about the sound after the frog disappears. It's this very strange poem. Lots of commentary written about this poem, and sort of something transformative in the world of haiku. But here are a couple Basho haiku quickly. One here, and these are translations by by Robert Hass, the American poet Robert Hass, who put together this collection of haiku called the Essential Haiku, I think in the 80s. And it's just a fantastic book
Mhm.
that, as a poet, everyone should know about. But so here's one, as translated by Robert Hass: a snowy morning by myself, chewing on dried salmon. Again, a snowy morning by myself, chewing on dried salmon. So, as you know, something that Basho does, it's so much about sensation, right? So much of what this is about, and so much of what haiku is about, is about a body interacting with the world outside, right? This series of touches between the body and the world outside, the body and the body being the thing that we all share, as well as even says the common denominator, right? Our common denominator um, of the world we share. So, and do you want me to read one more?
Sure.
Okay, another one. Well, there are so many. A bucket of azaleas, in its shadow, the woman tearing codfish.
I love
Um,
that. The contrast between the two things.
right. And another one, the winter leeks, as in the vegetable. The winter leeks have been washed white. How cold it is.
Mm,
Or another, pine mushroom, some kind of leaf sticking to it. So they're
that's
very simple, as you can see.
Could
Or
you
here's
read that
another,
last one again, Jeffrey?
yes, pine mushroom, some kind of leaf sticking to it. And one more, still alive and frozen in one lump, the sea slugs.
Ooh,
Yeah. So
I love that. That's all basho, right? Basho,
that's all
basho.
Basho. Right, exactly.
Can you tell us that some people define the haiku by seasons?
Yeah, that was a really important thing when, even in the early days of the haikai, when they were doing this collaborative poem, is each verse or each person had to make some kind of reference to a season. It was really important that there was a word or phrase. It didn't have to be the name of the season, but it had to somehow refer to and make clear what season it was.
Hmm, hmm.
This is something, again, I talked about how ideas about haiku changed and people pushed boundaries. So it became something later that people would people would insist it's not necessary to have this season word. But I think, through most of the history, people have used a season word, because we're immersed in the world. The seasons are what the world is doing around us, right? So we are a body moving through a world that goes through changes and seasons. Anyway, yeah,
The season sort of anchors the poem to some outside reality, and then the sensation comes layers over that, I guess.
yeah,
I just find it so intense commentary on so few words that can generate so much response.
absolutely.
So, Jeffrey, do you have a favorite translation?
So there are several translators I really like, but I think I like Robert Hass. There's this guy Makoto Ueda I really love. Burton Watson is a great translator, and then my friend Hiroaki Sato, I love him, who lives here in New York and has been translating, just doing beautiful translations of Japanese poetry for many decades. And so he is one of my favorites. And then also is R.H. Blythe, who I mentioned before, who was this kind of amazing sort of man with an encyclopedia mind, who was imprisoned in Japan during World War II because he was a Brit in Japan during the time, and managed to write all of these amazing books of translations.
Jeffrey, there are two other important and famous haiku writers. Could you talk about Busan?
Sure. Busan was sometime after Basho, and Busan was a painter, so very visual. And I think, later I know that Shiki sort of and some other, the sort of newer haiku poets kind of rejected Basho in favor of Busan because he seemed a little, more interesting and colorful. But yeah, Busan wrote very beautiful painterly haiku because he looked at the world in a very visual way.
Could you read one for us, please?
Sure, sure. Let's see here. Oh, so there's this, very sort of well-known haiku by Busan. Very simple. It just goes, butterfly sleeping on a temple bell.
Oh,
Butterfly sleeping on the temple bell. And uh, this is, for me, it's an example of how a haiku can use very few words, obviously, be immediately apprehensible. Like you can see it, it's very, very easy to see and understand, and you don't have to think about it at all. But if you do start thinking about it, kind of going over it, kind of munching on it in your mind, you see all of these interesting contrasts and oppositions taking place with the butterfly and the bell and color and size and duration, and the idea that we're looking at a moment here, a moment of repose, but also a moment of tension that can end at any moment, right? At any moment, the bell, if it enters the state of its true bellness, it rings. And the butterfly flies suddenly away, and this moment of rest and repose and peace is gone. Of course, the butterfly is very new and ephemeral, and the bell is very old and permanent. And so lots of interesting things happening with time and size and duration.
it's the time. It's
Yeah.
it's the moment before something happens.
Yes. Yeah, definitely.
So, Jeffrey, I think you talk a lot about Issa, Issa, the third in the triumvirate.
Yeah. Yeah. Issa is really interesting because so, I have my students read haiku all the time, and then I ask them to imitate. But in the beginning, I don't want them to read or imitate Issa. I want them to start with poets like, Basho and Busan and maybe Shiki, but I don't want them to look at Issa yet or imitate him yet because he's such a big personality. He's such an amazing big personality. I mean, I guess a sort of parallel might be like Whitman, right? How Whitman is like this grand, big, beloved personality who's sort of out there in his poems. But Issa is always the interesting thing about him, where these other poets are very, I guess, more objective. Um, Issa is always sort of reacting to things in this very subjective way. And he makes it look very easy. He makes it look very easy, but there is, there's a reason why we're reading this guy 200 years later, right? Um, it's, when people do try to imitate him, it becomes clear like how hard what he's doing is. He's always doing something very subversive in his poems. Ultimately there's something kind of objective about it because he's watching himself in the state of being a human from this kind of strange, kind of detachment, and feeling that surprise and delight in watching himself reacting and perceiving the world. So he's doing kind of simultaneously perceiving something and then watching with delight the fact that he's this human being living in the world and having this reaction to something. I mean, we all sort of are experiencing that, right? We all sort of have, the philosopher William James called the great companion, right? Sort of like the thing that's always sort of watching outside of us and commenting on ourselves. And he really does that all the time in a really beautiful and delightful way.
He's the only one who did that.
He sort of is, at least, like, kind of constantly, right? He's always doing that. And he's also constantly showing us himself in these moments of real humanity, and showing himself in moments where he's sort of expressing not what he's supposed to be feeling, but what he is really feeling, right? Like the poem that all of so many times I saw on New Year's Day, this on my friends' Instagram feeds, on the Instagram feeds of poets, was this great poem by Issa that says, New Year's Day, everything in blossom, I feel about average, right? Which is so wonderful because it's like, oh, yes, the world is in this state of renewal and beauty, and the cherry blossoms are blooming. Why do I just feel like, just my same usual crappy self? Right? And it just, he gives us license to sort of feel the way we feel, right? And he does this, well, he has a poem where, he comes across the Buddha, on the statue of the Buddha in the winter field, and there's an icicle hanging from its nose. And of course, here we are with the honored the honored form of the Buddha here with a long rope of snot hanging from its nose. The implication. And here he is in this childish way, noticing this and kind of chuckling to himself. Not, he's never against what he's talking about. It's not like he's anti-Buddha or anti-religion. He's just noticing something and expressing it. He'll be meditating and slapping a mosquito, killing a mosquito while he's meditating. And it's like, he's not beyond killing while he's also trying to be a good Buddhist. These things exist side by side. So
the sublime and the ridiculous.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Is he like a trickster?
There is that sort of, there's that sort of feeling there. I guess you could say that.
Could you read some more, Isa?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's so many really good ones. And again, there's a subversiveness. Well, this is the one I was mentioning. All the time I pray to Buddha, I keep on killing mosquitoes. And, here's someone, we experience our moments of our, serious, we're trying to seriously have an experience of the sublime. So why do these damn things in the world keep interrupting us and keep showing us? There are mosquitoes. What is that wonderful, I can't remember the Latin phrase that means even et in Arcadia sum, I think it is, which means I'm even in Arcadia, even like in paradise.
Paradise.
Like, in the most wonderful earthly paradise, death is still there, right? Death is still present. You can't be perfect. And there he is trying to have that moment of sublimity. And there's the damn mosquitoes. So he's killing them.
But it would be so boring without the mosquitoes.
Yeah, exactly. Well, right? Then we cannot have the earthly paradise. Another one, maybe?
Yes,
maybe
please.
One more. Let's see. Oh, here's the one I mentioned. From the end of the nose of the Buddha on the moor hang icicles. And another one. Mother I never knew, every time I see the ocean, every time. He never did know his mother. He's someone who experienced great loss in his lifetime. He lost his daughter, he lost his son, he lost his wife, he lost his mother, yet he still managed to write these poems. It's kind of amazing when you look at his life. And here's a poem that I think really says something about that, where he says, the world of dew is the world of dew, and yet. Which, again, this kind of, feeling what he feels as a human, not what he's supposed to feel. Here's this kind of pious Buddhist sentiment. The world of dew is the world of dew. The world is ephemeral. The world passes, and we're supposed to accept that, right? That is the way of the world, ephemerality and pain. But at the end of those three lines, he says, and yet, like the pious sentiment is not enough. It's a poem about losing his daughter. It's not enough. Somebody tells you she's in heaven now, not good enough. Not good enough. Yeah, maybe you think it's true. Maybe he thinks it's true. He could be the best Buddhist in the world. But at that moment, it's not quite enough.
Thank you, Geoffrey.
He's always doing wonderful things like that. Writing poems about new snow for the rich. Writing shit about new snow for the rich is not art. And one final one, in response to a call for patriotic poems, kind of a contest, who can write the best patriotic poem? He wrote, these sea slugs, they just don't seem Japanese.
Ooh.
So again, who knows how patriotic or not, he is, but it's just the idea that, if you ask a poet to write a kitschy poem, right, of patriotism, you're going to come up with something good that undermines it also, something subversive.
You're listening to Planet Poet Words in Space on WIOX Community Radio, live and local in the Catskills. I'm your host, Sharon Israel, here with my guest, poet, teacher, and editor, Geoffrey Nutter. Joining us now from Manhattan is Planet Poets Poet at Large, Pamela Monche Pierce. The Pushcart Prize nominee is working on her collection of Planet Poet Poet at Large spots to create an ebook. Hello, Pamela.
Hello, Sharon. Hello, Geoffrey. This is so wonderful. I would be happy to give up my 10 minutes to hear more, an extra 10 minutes of you, Geoffrey. I'm just absolutely loving it. I love all these images, and it's just wonderful. So I'm going to absolutely be listening to this when it's broadcast, and I will only be able to devote my attention to you. So thank you very much. Great, it's great to be with both of you. I mean, it's one of my favorite times is being with both of you, and as you know, I love being on the show. I think I've been talking with Sharon, and I think that she has done over all these years. Is it 12 years, Sharon? It's about 12 years now.
12 years.
It flew, and we've had such a wonderful time, and I'm so happy to have done so many poet at large spots. And now that they're on podcasts, I can pull some together and create my own ebook.
Isn't that such a great idea?
I think it's a great idea.
I love it.
And doing this little retrospective, which I've been doing since Sharon and I have been talking about this, I realized that among my favorite things have been my series of, which I called cross-pollination, where I discuss the connection between poets and poetry and other visual arts. Ekphrastic work by poets, of course, has been a very large part of that. This work inspired by other works of art. And even more surprising and even more interesting to me is looking at poetry written by visual artists. We spent time here on Planet Poet feeling Picasso's broken heart as he took a year off only to write poetry, which was really, really, I know Sharon will remember that, it was really quite wonderful. And then to me, even more surprising, Chagall, with his floating brides and bouquets, being enraged at the inattention and inaction given to the Holocaust, and writing very angry poetry. At the same time, his work, his visual art, became very dark. So I remember, you remember that too, Sharon. That was a real good, interesting surprise for us. Today, I'm going to talk about Cy Twombly. Cy Twombly, a painter, sculptor, and lover of poetry, although not a poet himself. Along with Robert Rauschenberg and Jasper Johns, he is considered to be representatives of a generation of artists who distanced themselves from abstract expressionism. If Cy Twombly's work does not come to mind instantly, you probably have seen it in these gigantic canvases of scribbled lines that look like vague handwriting or some kind of graffiti or indecipherable words in chalk on a blackboard. Those are among his most recognizable works. Twombly was born in 1928 and he died in 2011. And he was very influenced early on by his years as a student in 1950 and 51 as a scholarship student at the Art Students League. The Art Student League motto is no day without a line, and doing a line every single day, which pertain to any of the other arts. At this point, as a student there, Twombly begins drawing in the dark. So you can see what happens to his drawing when he doesn't have the other part of his brain, where he doesn't have his brain working, and he does that. He goes to Black Mountain College, and along with Franz Klein and Robert Motherwell, and he falls under the influence of the the chairman of the school, the head of the school, the poet Charles Olson. They have many, many, many discussions about line and the line in poetry and what the line means, and that words are material things. So Olson is a huge influence on Twombly. And then Twombly becomes a cartographer in the army. So lines are following him everywhere.
Oh, fascinating.
The reason for him to be in his work. Then he moves to Rome, where he sees graffiti and buildings with fragmented inscriptions, striations in ancient monuments. He gets involved with mythology and the intoxicating atmosphere, which we all know about, of the Eastern Mediterranean. This has captured his imagination, and it informs everything that he does after that. He falls in love with the ancient world, with mythology and all the parts of it. He begins to add words to these lines, then start to become words. And his gestural drawing, which are scratches and tactile, they're energetic, they're scarring, like all these buildings he has seen. And he begins to add words to them, not in the way that Braque and Picasso or other collage makers have added words, which is usually text lifted from someone else. But
or newspapers, right, Pamela?
Newspapers, any of that. This is handwritten cursive writing, which is a very, very big deal to visual artists. And I know this from my own experience of years not being able to do it and having a very big breakthrough this winter where I just went through it and I was able to write with my own hand in paint. And it is your own hand. It's imperfect. It's a signature. It's messy. It's imperfect. And it's you. So this is what he began to do. And he's adding all of these other words, the work of poets to his canvases. John Yao, the poet and art critic for Hyperallergic, who I've done as on one of my segments as poet at large with his book Bijou in the Dark. He wrote about in 2018, and he quote, Cy Twombly's in Cy Twombly's extravagant synesthesia, quote, Twombly's distilled compression is a form of synesthesia, the joining of two or more senses into one indivisible experience. Twombly's inimitable gift, the simultaneous condensation and expansion of different senses, such as sight, touch, and smell. His painting, Untitled to Sappho, in 1976, onto that canvas, he inscribes this line of Sappho. Like a hyacinth in the mountains trampled by shepherds, until only a purple stain remains on the ground.
Ooh.
Shall I read that again?
Yes.
Like
Geoffrey,
a hyacinth.
I'm sorry, you can jump in any time, Geoffrey. Sorry, Pamela, go ahead. That's so beautiful.
I love that one. I love
this one too. Like a hyacinth in the mountains, trampled by shepherds, until only a purple stain remains on the ground.
Oh.
And near that line, Twombly leaves stain of violet wax, which to me looks like a floating cloud of lines. I hear it, I see it, I smell it, and I feel it. So I have had this wonderful experience working today to bring this all together. I had my own Stendhal syndrome experience in a gallery with Twombly's work, where I really felt that I was swooning from the beauty of it. And I became so involved with it that as the gallery was closing, they had to ask me to leave.
For
so
real?
I have a special love of Cy Twombly. I don't know who translated that line. I just have to say that because translators are very important to me, as you know. I don't know who translated that line of Sappho, but we'll just have to let that go.
That's such a beautiful little treatise on Twombly. It had such beautiful flow to it. in the line, and he
Thank you.
expanded on it. It's wonderful. And it goes with the haiku, so with the feeling
Yes, it does.
and the
It does.
sappho, and it's all wonderfully echoing each other. Thank
Well, it
you.
was a great pleasure. It was a great play. This one was really a pleasure for me. So now I can relax and I can listen to Geoffrey and thoroughly enjoy myself.
Thank you so much, Pamela Moshe Pierce, Planet
Great.
Poets, Poet at Large.
Bye. Thank you.
Beautiful segment. Bye-bye.
Oh, that was great, Pamela. Thank you. That was really, I learned a lot. Yeah.
It was wonderful. It was so reflective of what we've been talking about. Geoffrey, you had talked about Isa and objectivity. Could you explain what objectivity is?
Well, that's kind of a strange complicated thing, isn't it? I mean, I guess I would have to like the simplest way, I guess I could talk about it. I mean, we talk about different kinds of objectivity, right? But I think when we're talking about poetic objectivity, it's focusing on the object, the thing outside of the poet or the world, right? The poet as subject, and the thing outside in the world, outside of the poet in the world as being the object. So objectivity is focusing on the object, focusing on the thing in the world.
I think Nick Flynn once talked about cathexis, the power of the object. I don't know if that's connected, but it seems like it. And his influence on the West, you had mentioned the something called aesthetic coldness.
Yeah. So, yeah, this is something, because poetry is very moving, right? Poetry is very moving, but there's other things that are very moving too, very emotionally moving, that move you emotionally. And I guess I was thinking about something like, great oratory, right? And how that can move you
Mhm.
um, so deeply. And, what is the difference between sort of the way that poetry or art moves you and the way that that moves you? Or the way that like a movie that makes you cry, moves you, something like that. And, I think that there is obviously that's very important, in tragedy, Aristotle talked about, this kind of catharsis that can happen, right? Which is really basically, it's like us seeing a tragedy or seeing a sad movie and crying and then sort of noticing ourselves crying and feeling like we're human again, right? That sort of feeling like, look, I'm crying, I'm a human being, I have feelings, as being a really important thing. But it seems to me it's also important, a kind of coldness is important also. And I think, when we hear that, we might reject that out of hand, and sort of like, well, beauty, there's not a coldness in beauty.
Mhm.
But I mean, a sort of focus on objectivity, I think it's necessary also, for a poet not to try to play on the emotions of the poet, or
Right.
not even to focus on his or her own emotions, but just to present the world, just present something in the world as objectively and sort of coldly as possible. And that does not preclude, having a great emotional power attached to it, right?
Yes.
But it's sort of also giving us room, to feel what we're going to feel, rather than trying in any way. I feel like something like propaganda is something that's expressly trying to move our emotions in one specific
That's
direction,
right. To direct them. That's right.
right? And poetry needs to be as far away from propaganda as it can
Mhm.
possibly be. And I guess as far away as it can possibly be is something that does not try to point our emotions in any
Mhm,
direction
mhm.
or try to manipulate our emotions in any way. Uh,
It's
that's not to say like the poems of, Isa, as I mentioned, are very subjective and they're very emotional in a way, but there's also this strange element of objectivity, um, because he's looking at himself. He's kind of like looking at himself from the outside.
the observer.
But I think like a kind of aesthetic coldness is necessary, and it also, the idea that we need to be emotional when looking at art is something that I think that we should question also, right? Because there's a great freedom. I think like one of the things that excites me most is looking at, abstract sculpture, right? Like architecture and abstract sculpture. Really, I find it to be sort of the equivalent of really objective imagery in poetry, right?
Mm-hmm.
Meaning objective imagery in poetry sort of leaves something out there and you feel what you feel. It has a resonance. It sort of makes its own meaning. And it's the same thing. I mean, you'd think, that I could say like, well, that's what representational art would do. But no, for me, it's like something like abstract sculpture, which doesn't claim to mean anything or say anything. It's just shapes in space.
It's not direct. It's not directive.
Exactly. And for me, there's something like that appeals to my imagination, that frees my imagination, and that makes me wanna go write poems. It just makes me feel free in this way.
And you've taught us, and I'd say I've been in Wallson Glass, and so has Pamela. Pamela introduced me to your fabulous seminars. And the art of detached observation is very difficult just to do that. And you talk about that in your teaching in college. Could you, with your college students, could you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, this is, I use haiku to kind of present, this idea of, looking at the world and sort of getting it down, presenting images from the world, or how can I put this? Detached, right? A kind of detached observation of the world, but also in order to have that detachment, you have to draw very close to it, right? In a way. Basho talks about, Basho says something about this. He says, when to learn, to know the pine, you have to learn from the pine. You have to draw close to the thing that you're observing. So there's that, again, that the touches between the subject and the object, between us, the perceiver, and the world. But there needs to be, according to Basho, a kind of disinterestedness, not looking for something in it, not going to it to find anything specific in it, no preconceived notions about what the thing is. This is something that Wallace Stevens was also very, very interested in, preoccupied by, in a poem like Study of Two Pairs, where he presents these pairs and he presents them in a way, where he wants to teach us how to see them and teach himself, really, how to see these things stripped of any preconceived notions of what they are. And then at the end of the poem, he says, the pairs are not seen as the observer wills. And so, I mean, this, you could say that this is the whole project of poetry, ultimately, is to sort of see the world in a way that isn't sort of contaminated is kind of a strong way to say it, but sort of like, affected by the way that you look at the world,
Right.
but sort of look at the world in a disinterested way for itself.
And if you do that, it becomes unique in your own presentation.
It's very hard. It's very hard for, to write about to just present images is very difficult. It takes a lot of training to do that, and it seems like that should be the easiest thing to do. But I always, this is an assignment I give students, and it's always the hardest assignment. It's always the hardest thing for them to do. I give all these caveats. I say, no metaphor. I want you to write these images, no metaphor, no simile, nothing literary, no humor, right? No pious sentiments about anything. I don't want to know what a nice person you are by writing about events or something. I want you just to present something in the world outside of yourself. So hard, so hard.
Poets, I hope you're listening. This is important. Geoffrey, now for something completely different. Or not different. Would you read, you're writing a long form poem. Could you explain briefly about it and read us a segment?
Sure. So yeah, I've been working on this poem for a few years. Sort of, I'm working, sort of a parallel thing right now is working on a book of shorter poems, but I've been working on this long book-length poem for a while. That sort of has this really loose narrative to it, but not really, because I'm not ultimately interested in narrative being a poet, but I'm trying to have some sort of thread that goes through it to kind of keep things together. So this little section that I'm going to read is involves characters in this poem, this sort of group of characters who are experiencing this kind of period of difficulty and growth, sort of in the form of a terrible thing that's happening in the world that's kind of unnamed. But they all kind of get together and they decide to have a haiku contest, or sort of like a collaborative haiku game. So again, I'm trying to do all kinds of things in this poem, and a long poem, can contain all kinds of different things, which is part of why it was so fun for me. So in this little section of the poem, the person who's kind of a leader in this group, who's named Dai Fan, was actually the name of a real person in China who sort of led me around China and a group of other people. She sort of gives a little disquisition on haiku to start this thing. So she gives a little speech about haiku. So I'll read that little bit. A few insomniacs lingered late into the night. One suggested the children gather and try some linked verse in the garden. When finally it was time for their symposium, they poured the cups small and clear as teardrops, and Dai Fan set about to clarify the rules. First the haiku, that will be yours, Ursula, and of course you know the rules. Remember to keep it changing. It must change from verse to verse, from line to line. You know that the tree will not stay tree. The thing that is most tree might pass into something else. You must forget it and do so knowingly. The abandoned primary school in front of the mountains, closed for the day for the bicycle holiday. The stack of roof tiles against a concrete wall. You started with the tree, then worked your way around to them. We have no idea what they reveal. Look, central to the practice, as you know, we must refine, change the problem. And through beginning, as in a triangle, it becomes the solution. We are equipped, but naturally we cannot prepare. The tree is all spackled over with blossoms like a bride, performing each sentence, each sequence like a bride under the equinox, abstract and persisting, filled and suffused with purifying sentience. The catboat in its easy drifting, moving with exultant speed, the captain at the tiller steering with a touch, and it is heading out of the harbor and out onto open sea. He knows he must hold it as the knitter holds the ball of yarn, and she lets it unspool gently, and at once it might fall and roll across the floor. It might come to symbolize winter or spring or even something else. She too is watching as the green wrap, a kind of verdant roundness, disappears in its unspooling. Likewise, let the verses quarrel gently. They should be mundane, but mundane as fire is mundane. It's like the sword's edge, but it doesn't matter, as long as it is fitting. Then you spend years growing as haunted as the sea. Now the shadows came into play. Now the shadows are coming into play, she resumed. They are miscreant, refractory like children, yet they are instructive. Their pleasures must be learned like branches, the way that branches learn when a pear tree is a failure to a fence. The boughs are flexible as they grow into their pattern while forgetting it. We should be like them in the state where there can be no forgetting, only growth and form, presence, responsiveness. The Milky Way was visible spread across the sky. Jupiter was visible, clear as water and as near. The shopkeeper ate a strawberry, and the basket there beside her trembled. It was almost morning, and dew was on the grass. A horse was grazing there. A small girl offered it an apple. She was crying, or had been. Now the whole group of youths sat on the long table under the pavilion strung with lights. They unwrapped their plates and rinsed them with tea poured from a kettle over them. A great bark-colored moth opened and closed its wings, watchful on a plate of boiled lotus. An old woman, the proprietress, gathered it up in her hands and tore it in half like a head of black lettuce. But to continue the disquisition on haiku for just a moment more, where a nerve consists of both oil and marble, like something found on the seashore. And when you pass a verse to the person beside you, it is easy. You must feel a thrill of volatility. Something might develop, but this is not for certain. No one will promise a thing. Indeed, all is contingent. And if you do not feel it, you must make it so, or feel so. There, my dear ones, we love those things of beauty, and we want to hold it. But consider the bee succinctly, it tumbles from the auspicious rose, or walks across the lily. Oh, to be a bee, friend or kindred spirit to the katydid, the ant whose stately tiles of armor arrange themselves serenely. That is to be innocent, innocent and unafraid. But innocence is always unafraid. Be innocent and brave.
Oh my goodness. That was Geoffrey Nutter reading from his so far unnamed book.
It's called Emissaries.
That was one of the most beautiful things I've heard ever. It ends with almost ends with the shopkeeper eating a strawberry. That's very haiku. Just beautiful, Geoffrey.
Had to
Thank
mix in a
you.
little bit of haiku-ishness.
Oh, yes. It's,
I follow that with maybe 50, the group sort of going through their haiku, and there's maybe 50 of them in there. But as I read this, I thought, maybe that's something I need to leave to the imagination.
it's beautiful. It's amazing how a long form a poet can distill the haiku somehow. It's great. Thank
It's
so much.
I'm writing about haiku in the most long-winded way,
Oh yeah, but it's
violating every rule of haiku.
I can't even describe how it works. It works beautifully for this whole discussion. Thank you, Geoffrey. Geoffrey, thanks for a beautiful show. It was
Thank
wonderful to have
you.
you.
This
And-
is so great. I love talking to you and Pamela.
And Pamela, thank you. Pamela Moshe Pierce, poet at large. Geoffrey Nutter, fabulous poet and teacher. Geoffrey, if people want more information on you and your work, could you give me a link? Could you let us know?
Sure. They can go to my website, which is wallsonglass.com, and that'll, has some information about my work and my my poetry sessions.
Thank you, Geoffrey. I'm a happy camper today. And,
Thank you so much. This was so fun.
and thank you all for listening.